Hello, and welcome to the Mr. 50mm YouTube channel. Today, I got the Olympus E-330. It's the forgotten sibling of the E-300. Some of you may know that CCDs are cool again, and so cameras like the E1, E300, E500, and if you can find it, the E400, they're hot stuff. But does that mean that this live MOS powered E330 is just poop? If I take a photo with it, will I be sad? Will I be rendered into a puddle of tears of disappointment? In short, no. That said, I do want to be clear, in this particular video, we're not doing a sensor comparison, although that will happen. I originally wanted to do that with the D200 versus the D300, but I've yet to come across a D300. So I believe we'll probably be seeing the video be done via E330 versus E300. Maybe, but that's for another video. For now, let's have a look at the E330 on its own. What is the E330? Well, this is the E330, and it's the successor to this, the E300. It was announced in the 26th of January 2006. It's a 4/3 camera, meaning it's got a 2x crop. The sensor in here is a 7.5 megapixel live MOS sensor. It has an ISO range of 100 to 800, or up to 1600 with boost enabled. The shutter is good from 60 seconds to 1/4000th of a second. Flash sync is at 1/180th or up to, and it shoots at a whole 3 FPS for another whole 4 RAWs. There is a built-in flash, and at ISO 100, the GN value is 13 in meters. Autofocus on this camera is a 3-point affair, and it actually features a built-in dust reduction system. Neat for the era. Being an SLR, there is a optical finder. It is a poro finder, like the E300, hence the relatively flat top deck. The rear of the camera is anointed with a 2.5-inch rear LCD featuring 215K dots. And the camera actually has tilting LCD action. Whoa. And that's a pretty unique feature at the time. It's also got live view, hence the tilty LCD. And we're going to get into that later. The E330 features dual card slots, a compact flash card, and a XD picture card slot. It's powered by the BLM1 battery, which, as of writing in April of 2026, you can still buy third-party replacements. With batteries, this body weighs in at 616 grams. And when the camera was new, it cost $999 US, body only. Nice. That means today, that is around 1620 USD. Not bad. Otherwise, that's around 2260 Canadian pesos. What's special about the E330 Live View? Well, in the modern era, we kind of take live view for granted. We assume it's going to be there and it's going to be pretty good. However, if we go back to the days of the E330, this was a kind of a new thing, and the implementation on the E330 was kind of novel. Remember that in this era, the only other DSLR that had live view was the Fujifilm S3 Pro. And that was a gimmick. It was black and white and only worked for 30 seconds. And if you count other cameras, like cameras that just have big sensors, then you have the Sony R1 as well, bringing the amount of cameras with live view in that era to 3. So that's pretty neat that the E330 is kind of close to the first of its type. It's the third of its type, I suppose. The E330, though, arguably actually had a pretty useful implementation of live view for a DSLR. On top of that, it sought to solve some issues that came with live view on DSLRs. Let's discuss what those issues are and how the E330 sought to overcome it. First, autofocus. At this time, on-sensor AF just wasn't really a thing, not for DSLRs. DSLRs normally had a separate dedicated AF module, and it used light that was redirected from the main mirror into the AF module. So most of the light would make it to your eye holes via OVF, and a tiny portion would usually be bounced down towards the AF sensor. And again, that's what drove your autofocus. Now with live view, if the mirror is up, then light does not get bounced, and it's only really going into the sensor. So the module doesn't work. Now, for one reason or another, we can assume that a combination of slow reading speed, lower computing power, and lenses not optimized for contrast detect, live view in this kind of mode where you just directly read off the sensor wasn't really possible at this time. And usually on cameras that did try to do contrast detect AF in this era, it tended to be horrible, slow, and it really bogged down those cameras. The E330 thought of a different way to get you your autofocus. If you couldn't do contrast detection well, could you still set it up so that you could use the AF module that the camera already had? Therefore, you'd still get a pretty good autofocusing speed, but it also means you can't just raise the mirror and stop the light flow to the AF sensor. Thus, you can't use your actual imaging sensor to do your live view. So they placed a smaller sensor in the body, and it borrowed some light off that last bounce towards the human eye hole. And a bit of that light gets redirected to another sensor at the same time. And that means that you get live view, but not using your primary imaging sensor. And Olympus called this Live View A. And it just kind of powers up the sensor when you put live view on, like so. Ooh, look at that. And autofocus is as good as if it were through the OVF, since it is just using the regular AF sensor. It does come with some drawbacks though. First, coverage in Live View A is 92%. Part of this is that on the E330, coverage is already dropped to around 95%, but there's a bit of extra tax with the sensor on top. Additionally, because the sensor is very small and jammed into whatever space they had, you kind of don't have a lot of resolution with it, so there's no punch-in zoom. Now, let's say you wanted to do some manual focus work, and you wanted to punch in to check before you snapped your photos. Olympus has you covered. You see, they invented another mode called Live View B over here. And that's a good name, by the way. In this mode, you get what we're normally used to seeing in today's cameras. The image on display is directly read off the image sensor. As a result, you do get 100% frame coverage, more than that if you're looking through the OVF. On top of that, this camera does also allow a 10x punch-in. Let's see if I can get it to do it. That's pretty punched in. And this allows you to do fine focus adjustment. And if you are on firmware 1.2 or newer, they had a new function enabled. You could actually use the AF module to run the autofocus. You do this by holding this button here, AEL, and it would temporarily drop the mirror, allowing you to use the AF module. And here's the thing. Normally, if you do this, you'd be in the dark. But because this camera also has the Live View A mode, again, awesome name, really, you have a bit of lag, but no real blackout. The sensor in the Live View A mode would kick in while the mirror was down, and you'd get your autofocus, and as soon as it confirmed, the mirror would go back up, and you'd transition back into your Live View B mode. Of course, there's a bit of a small delay, but I think it's actually a pretty innovative way to do it. And all this resulted in what, in theory, Olympus probably thought was it having its cake and eating it. However, it was generally seen as an implementation that was too complicated and too clunky. Additionally, there were aspects of both live view systems that were not addressed. For example, none of the live view modes had exposure simulation. The camera would only give you live view as a framing live view, so altering your shutter speed and or aperture wouldn't give you a simulation. The system also had some strange oddities tossed in for good measure. For example, we're all pretty familiar with framing guidelines, right? Your rule of thirds, your golden rules. On a mirrorless camera, you can call up the grids and usually it's good to go. And those actually also came with the E-330. But did you know the E-330 also came with passport photo mode? Let's pull that up now. So as you can see on display, we have no frame lines. And all of a sudden, there you go. There is guidelines for how to frame up a passport photo. That's odd. Additionally, for some reason, the different framing guides are separated to only some being in Live View A, that got the passport mode, super cool, and Live View B got other ones, your normal ones, your rules of thirds. Let me know if anyone here has used the E-330 as a passport camera. Here's my 2 cents about the implementation though. I think Olympus did a solid job. They gave the Live View a dedicated set of controls right there, so you can toggle between your modes and instantly activate it by pressing this button. And they're easily within reach of your right thumb. And it generally didn't require menu diving, and it wasn't just a repurposed button. It was, as I said, a dedicated one. And overall, hopping in is pretty quick. Here is the Live View off, and here you're in Live View A. Super quick. And it's something that I was actually using on this camera. Combined with the fact that you get your tilty display, like so, it actually made the E-330 kind of feel modern. So I do end up using the LCD to compose on the E-330, as I would on a newer mirrorless camera. I still do prefer the EVF or OVF if it's got it, but where sometimes I want to get a funky angle or I kind of don't want to crane myself down, then I can just be lazy, stick this thing in live view and still get my shot and get the angle that I want. And overall, I find that it's pretty seamless. I don't think the system is nearly as clunky as initial reviews might have made readers feel like it was. And I think this is especially true when you compare to other companies that at the time shoveled in live view. Canon, Nikon. Canon and Nikon's initial implementations were just the regular direct sensor readout, which is fair enough. But they couldn't leverage something like the A mode on the E-330 to fill in the gaps when the camera had to drop the mirror. And their implementations of early contrast detection were straight up horrible. Operation and feel. So the E-330 is pretty similar to the E-300. So I'm only gonna more or less talk about some of the differences. I'll link to the original E-300 review if you're interested in having a look. It's a pretty good review, I think, despite being one of my kind of early videos. At any rate, we'll start with the feel. The E330, I think, is a more cohesive design than the E300. If you remember, the E300 over here used a slightly polarizing two-tone design with plastic across most of the body, and then you have this metal front and top hat thingy. The E330, it's plastic all around. And say what you will about plastics, but it's consistent. And I do actually think that it looks pretty good. Although admittedly, I kind of do like the flare of the metal hat on the E300 a little bit more. But I understand the choice that Olympus made to make this a little more uniform. The gap, sorry, not the gap, not sure what that has to do with anything. The grip on the E300 is also modified. Again, I'm going to hold both of these up. The E300 grip is not bad, but the E330's is significantly more comfortable. It is both a bit deeper, and they got rid of this weird ridge thingy that was on the E300. And overall, it's a more comfortable experience, at least I find. For controls, at a glance, the cameras look very familiar, very similar. But they actually made quite a few changes to the control layout, and I think it was for the better. Now, more of your shooting-related controls are focused on your right hand, and the buttons are also just a bit nicer to press. They protrude out a bit more, and they're just easier to feel around and hit. One nice change that I do want to point out is that they also actually added in an exposure comp button. It's this tiny button right here. It's got its place just behind the shutter, and I really enjoyed this button. For me, this is a much more useful place to put it. On the E300, for at least in my opinion, it kind of slowed you down because you needed to use your thumb to hit the exposure comp and then move your thumb back up to adjust it. But on this camera, you hit the button right by your shutter and your thumb can already be there, ready to move it where it's gotta go. The LCD obviously received an upgrade, and it's not just dot count. I already mentioned the tilting hinge, but it's interesting because the hinge isn't where you normally see it on a camera today. You can see over here, the hinge is mounted on the bottom. And that kind of means that you don't just pull it with your thumb to angle it up. You actually have to pull it out and then raise the display upwards. And this seems kind of weird at first, but if you noticed, when you do that on this camera, it allows the LCD to clear your OVF. But for me, I still find it kind of weird that the first position that it goes to is your overhead shot. But otherwise, I think it's a pretty good idea and it accomplishes what it sets out to do. And the hinge, even after all this time, still feels very stiff, very sturdy. Good stuff. Now, let's talk about the optical viewfinder. There's a bit of a tax here. If you have an E300 and you think the finder looks a bit dim, the E330 is not going to help you. There's a bit of a tax with the way the light gets split into that live view sensor and the light that ultimately hits your eyeball. The finder is dimmer. If you don't have an E300 beside you, you probably wouldn't notice, but I do. And I did notice it is dimmer. I miss the light that isn't touching my eyeballs. But it's all right, it's touching that live view A sensor. Image quality and autofocus. Again, another reminder, this isn't a direct comparison against the E300. And it's quite nice Kodak CCD. We are here to talk about the E330 on its own-ish. And I know, the camera seems a little bit odd because despite being a little bit of a newer camera, despite having a newer sensor, the pixel count is slightly less than the E300. That's an older camera, but it's not without cause. This is their first crack at a sensor with Panasonic and whatever other companies that worked on this thing. It's the debut of the Live MOS sensor. And one of the things that it was trying to accomplish wasn't necessarily resolution, but having enough read speed to support live view. And I think it did that job fairly fine, while maintaining a reasonable image quality that competed similarly, if not better, than the CCDs that came before it. But set your standards here with these older cameras. Dynamic range, high ISO performance, those expectations are to be tempered. The E330 doesn't offer crazy headroom for dynamic range, and it is more or less in line with the cameras of this era. So you're not going to be pushing and pulling files like crazy. When it comes to noise, I think with this camera, I'm pretty comfortable at 100 to 800 ISO. That's about where I'd want to keep it. 1600 is a bit dicey, and you really want to avoid it unless you're okay with either losing some detail or going through a considerable amount of noise reduction. Pretty normal for a camera of this time. Overall, I do actually like the images that came out of the E330. I like the raw files. Overall, they look good, and with a bit of tweaking, they still turn out to be very nice images, just like on the E300. And I find that it also makes naturally pretty punchy images too, again, like the E300. And the slight drop in resolution versus the E300, for me, is pretty negligible. When it comes to autofocus, I will again refer to the E300 review, because it's the same module, it does the same thing. Although if you really don't want to click to see that, this camera, the E330, it is a focus and recompose affair. The system itself works well enough for stills, tracking is meh, and its speed overall is a bit slow, even for the era. Now let's talk about shutter sound. It's pretty similar to the E300, but it's a tiny bit faster, and therefore it's worth a listen. Let's shoot a burst. Wow. Yeah, it's basically the same sound. Overall, it's not bad, but this is not my favorite. It's not the worst. The mirror thud, I think, is fine. It's the sound after that I'm not a huge fan of. Recommendation and conclusion. I will cut to the chase. No, I don't recommend this camera. The series in general has seen a bit of an increase in popularity. Prices for the E330s are seemingly about the same as the prices for the E300, except they look like they're a little bit harder to find. And as a general starting point for if you're someone that's just looking for a DSLR at that price range, there's a lot of better options. But on that note, the current going price for these seems to be around 150 to 200 USD for a working one in good shape. And again, looking around, they were harder to find than the E300s. Now, that being said, the one draw to this camera is that even at that price point, if you're looking for a budget Panasonic L1, the E330 might be for you. And really that's about it, since the L1s are crazy money and they are sensor-wise the same as this camera. Also shape-wise, they're pretty close. Panasonic did their thing and the L1 has a following because of it. But yeah, if you want to look for a poor person L1, the E330 is going to be it. And again, if you're just looking for a DSLR to start, really at this price range, you have a whole bevy of other cameras from the likes of Canon and Nikon. And even if you want to stick with Olympus, there are other Olympus cameras that are cheaper and offer similar performance and offer CCDs if you're looking for that. Don't get me wrong though, I do like the E330 a lot. Generally, I like it more than the E300 as a picture taking thing. As an evolution of the series, the E330 did a lot of things and corrected a lot of things with the E300. And I think their live view implementation was pretty ahead of its time and not nearly as clunky as some reviewers made it out to seem to be. If only by the fact that Canon and Nikon really dropped the ball comparatively in their initial implementations of live view. Now, if you do come across one as a kit locally and it's a good price like me, like I got mine for 120 Canadian buckaroos and it came with the 2 lens kit, the one that covers 14 to like 45 and then 45 to 150 or whatnot. And it actually came with the FL36 flash, which is an awesome flash and still works on modern Micro Four Thirds cameras. Then yeah, go for it. Go pick one of these up. But at their current going rate, again, there's just so many other options. But yeah, that's all I got. Look out sometime later for the E300 versus E330 shootout. I'm actually pretty curious to see what these things will do when I use them side by side to take the same photo. Let me know though, did you own an L1 or the E330 at some point? Do you remember live view from pre-2010? Let me know in the comments below. And as always, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Maybe a super thanks if you're into that. Till next time, bye.